I still remember the sound of his laugh echoing across the dinner table, sharp and careless, the kind of laugh that makes your stomach drop because you realize it wasn't meant to be shared. It was aimed directly at you. My own father looked me in the eye on my birthday and said, "You seriously expected a gift at your age?" And everyone else just sat there in awkward silence. That moment stuck with me in a way I can't fully explain, because weeks later, that same man was standing in front of me with tears in his eyes, begging for my help like I was his last option. And before I tell you how we got there, I need to ask you something straight up. Was I wrong for remembering how he treated me when the roles were finally reversed? Let me rewind, because to understand why that laugh cut so deep, you need to know the kind of relationship I had with my dad growing up. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal family. 2 parents, a modest house, no obvious drama. But inside those walls, everything revolved around my father, his moods, his opinions, his version of what was right. He wasn't physically abusive or anything extreme like that, which almost made it harder to explain why being around him felt so heavy. He believed that providing financially was the only form of love that mattered. Emotional support, encouragement, small gestures of kindness, those were, in his words, luxuries and weaknesses. As a kid, I learned pretty early not to ask for much. If I brought home a good report card, he'd nod and say, "That's what you're supposed to do." If I struggled with something, his response was always, "Figure it out. Life won't go easy on you." Birthdays were never a big deal in our house. When I was little, my mom tried, she'd bake a cake, maybe buy me a small present, but my dad always acted like it was unnecessary. "Every day you're alive is already a gift," he'd say, half joking, half serious. Still, as a child, I held on to hope. Kids do that. You keep thinking maybe this year will be different, maybe this time he'll smile, maybe he'll surprise me. As I got older, that hope faded into something quieter, more realistic. By the time I turned 18, birthdays had become just another day, except for a few, "Happy birthday" texts from friends and my mom's soft hug in the kitchen. Fast forward to my mid-20s. I was still living at home, not because I wanted to, but because life is expensive, and I was trying to save money. I had a decent job, paid some bills, helped around the house. I wasn't freeloading. That year, my birthday happened to fall on a weekend, and my mom suggested we all sit down for dinner together. Nothing fancy, just food, family, and maybe, for once, a calm evening. I didn't expect much. I really didn't. But there was a small, quiet part of me that thought maybe things had changed. I was older now. We had more adult conversations. Maybe he'd at least acknowledge it. Maybe he'd say something nice. Even a card would have meant something. Dinner started normally enough. My mom cooked my favorite dish, which already felt like a small win. We sat down, ate, talked about random things. Then my mom smiled and said, "Well, it is your birthday, after all." She looked at my dad, almost hopefully. That's when he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a playful laugh. It was dismissive, loud, and sharp. He leaned back in his chair and said, "What? Did you expect a gift or something?" He shook his head like the idea was ridiculous. "You're an adult. Birthdays don't mean anything anymore." I felt my face burn. I didn't even know what to say. I hadn't asked for anything. I hadn't hinted. I hadn't complained. But somehow, just the idea that I might have hoped for something was enough for him to mock me. My mom tried to smooth things over, saying, "It's just nice to celebrate." But the damage was done. I forced a smile. I laughed it off because that's what I've always done. Inside, though, something cracked. It wasn't about the gift. It was about feeling small, about being reminded, once again, that my feelings didn't matter to him. After dinner, I went to my room and sat there staring at the wall, replaying his words over and over. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I told myself I would stop expecting anything from him. No approval, no warmth, no acknowledgement. I would live my life, build my future, and keep my expectations low enough that he couldn't hurt me anymore. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. A few weeks later, life threw a curveball, just not at me. At him. My dad had always been proud of his independence. He worked the same job for decades and loved reminding everyone that he never needed help from anyone. "I take care of my own," was one of his favorite phrases. So when he came home one evening looking pale and shaken, it immediately set off alarm bells. At first, he brushed it off, said work was stressful, said he was tired, but over the next few days, I noticed things. He was on the phone constantly, pacing around the house. I heard fragments of conversations, words like deadline, documents, and problem. My mom looked worried but didn't say much, like she was waiting for him to explain when he was ready. Eventually, the truth came out. My dad was in serious trouble at work. Without getting too technical, there had been some changes in management, and a review of old projects uncovered a mistake, one that could potentially cost the company a lot of money. And because my dad had signed off on it years ago, the blame was landing squarely on him. There was talk of legal action, of termination, of everything he had built over decades unraveling. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Here's the part that matters to the story: my job. I worked in a field that, by pure coincidence, gave me experience with exactly the kind of issue my dad was facing. I wasn't a miracle worker, but I knew the system. I knew the language. I knew how to navigate the mess he was in. If anyone in the family could help him understand his options and possibly soften the fallout, it was me. At first, he didn't come to me. He tried to handle it himself, just like always. But the pressure kept building. Letters arrived. Calls increased. Sleepless nights became the norm. The strong, unshakable man I grew up with was slowly unraveling in front of me. One evening, my mom knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. She sat down and told me everything my dad had been hiding, the full extent of the situation, how serious it was, how scared she was. Then she said, "He needs your help." Those words hit me harder than I expected. My immediate reaction wasn't concern or sympathy. It was a flash of anger, hot and sharp. Now he needs me. Now, after years of dismissal, after mocking me on my birthday like my feelings were a joke. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just nodded and said I'd think about it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying memories from my childhood. Times I'd wanted his support, and didn't get it. Times I'd swallowed my feelings because it was easier than fighting. And then, right in the middle of those thoughts, that birthday dinner replayed itself in my mind. His laugh, his words. "You seriously expected a gift?" I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Did I owe him anything? Did being his child automatically mean I had to help him, no matter how he'd treated me? Or was this one of those moments where I was finally allowed to choose myself? The next day, my dad finally came to me himself. I was in the living room when he walked in and sat down across from me. He looked older somehow, smaller. He cleared his throat and said my name in a tone I'd never heard before, soft, unsure. He didn't apologize. Not yet. Instead, he started explaining the situation, stumbling over his words, clearly uncomfortable. He told me how serious it was, how he didn't know what to do next. Then he looked at me and said, "Your mother says you might be able to help." Might be able to help, not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Just an assumption that I would step in because it was convenient for him. I told him I'd need time to think. The look on his face in that moment was something I'll never forget. Confusion mixed with panic. Like it had never occurred to him that I might say anything other than yes. He nodded slowly and said, "Okay," then stood up and walked away. From that moment on, the house felt tense. Every interaction felt loaded. My mom tried to act normal, but I could tell she was terrified. My dad barely spoke to me, probably afraid of pushing too hard, probably struggling with his own pride. And me, I was stuck in the middle of a storm of emotions. Part of me wanted to help just to stop the chaos, to protect my mom, to do the right thing. Another part of me felt like this was the universe handing me a mirror and saying, "Remember how it felt." I started replaying the birthday incident again, not out of spite, but because it symbolized so much more than one bad comment. It represented years of emotional neglect, years of being told, indirectly and directly, that I didn't matter unless I was useful. Now, suddenly, I was useful. And that's where I'm going to pause the story for now, because this was the exact point where everything could have gone in completely different directions. This was the moment before the real decision, before the confrontation, before things were said that could never be taken back. Before I tell you what I ultimately decided to do, I want you to stop for a second and put yourself in my place. If the parent who dismissed your feelings for years suddenly needed you, would you help them without hesitation, or would you remember every time they made you feel small? Tell me honestly what you would have done, because in the next part, I'll tell you exactly how I responded and how it changed our relationship forever. When I left things off, I was standing right at the edge of a decision that felt way heavier than it should have been. Because on the surface it looked simple. My father was in trouble, I had the knowledge to help, and families are supposed to show up for each other. But nothing about our history was simple, and the longer I sat with it, the more I realized this wasn't just about his work problem. This was about years of silence, years of swallowed emotions, and that laugh on my birthday that somehow became the final straw. So before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you again, honestly, if someone only values you when they need you, are you still obligated to save them? That night after he spoke to me, I barely slept. My brain wouldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw different versions of the future. In one, I helped him immediately, smoothed everything over, and things went back to normal, which really meant him going back to being distant and dismissive once the crisis passed. In another version, I refused outright, and the fallout tore our family apart, leaving my mom caught in the middle and me branded as the ungrateful child who abandoned their parent when it mattered most. Neither option felt good, and that's what scared me the most. The next morning, I went to work on autopilot. I stared at my screen, pretending to focus, while my thoughts kept drifting back home. I knew exactly what kind of help my dad needed. I knew which documents to review, which arguments might work, which mistakes could be reframed as misunderstandings instead of negligence. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a weight. When I got home that evening, the house was unusually quiet. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, his head in his hands. My mom was making tea, her movements slow and careful, like she was afraid of making too much noise. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. I stood there for a moment, just watching them, and something inside me softened. Not enough to forget everything, but enough to remember that this wasn't just about him. My mom didn't deserve to suffer because of unresolved issues between me and my dad. She had spent her life playing peacekeeper, smoothing over conflicts, absorbing emotional fallout that wasn't hers to carry. So I sat down. My dad looked up, startled, like he hadn't expected me to join him. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then I took a deep breath and said, "I need to be honest with you before I agree to anything." He nodded, slowly. I told him how that birthday made me feel. Not just the comment, but what it represented. I told him that his laugh wasn't just a joke to me, it was a reminder of every time I felt dismissed, every time I felt like my emotions were inconvenient. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just spoke, calmly and clearly, probably for the first time in my life. At first, his reaction was exactly what I expected. He got defensive. He said he didn't mean it like that. He said I was too sensitive. He said birthdays weren't important. Hearing those familiar phrases made my chest tighten, and for a moment, I almost walked away. But then something unexpected happened. He stopped talking. He actually listened. I could see it on his face, the confusion, the discomfort, the slow realization that this wasn't just me complaining, that this was something deeper. When I finished, there was a long silence. My mom had stopped moving entirely, her eyes flicking between us like she was afraid to miss something important. Finally, My dad spoke, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said, "I didn't know you felt like that." I almost laughed at that, because of course he didn't know. He never asked. But instead, I said, "That's the problem. You never wanted to know." He nodded again, slowly, like he was processing something new and uncomfortable. Then, after another pause, he said the words I had waited years to hear, even though I didn't realize it until that moment. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect. But it was real." That apology didn't erase the past, but it cracked something open. And in that opening, I made my decision. I told him I would help, but not blindly, and not without boundaries. I made it clear that this wasn't a favor I was doing to be used and forgotten. If I stepped in, it was because we were trying to fix more than just his work problem. He agreed. At least, he said he did. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into helping him. We spent hours going through documents, emails, old reports. I explained things patiently, sometimes repeating myself when he didn't understand. There were moments when his old habits crept back in, when he'd get frustrated and snap, but this time I didn't stay quiet. I called it out immediately. And to his credit, most of the time, he caught himself and apologized. The situation at his job was messy, but slowly it started to improve. With the right explanations and some careful negotiation, the company backed away from legal action. He still faced consequences. A demotion, a loss of status, but he wasn't fired, and his career wasn't completely destroyed. When the final decision came through, my mom cried with relief. My dad didn't celebrate. He just sat there, staring at the letter, like he couldn't quite believe how close he'd come to losing everything. That night, after my mom went to bed, he knocked on my door. That alone was shocking. He never knocked. He always just walked in. I told him to come in. He sat down and looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "I don't think I've ever said thank you properly." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. He continued, "I've spent my whole life thinking that being strong meant not needing anyone, and I didn't realize how much that made me push people away. Especially you." That conversation didn't magically fix our relationship. We didn't hug it out and suddenly become close. But it was the beginning of something different. Over time, small things changed. He started asking about my day. He remembered important dates. On my next birthday, months later, he awkwardly handed me a small, wrapped box. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even something I really needed. But the gesture mattered more than anything inside it. Now, here's the part that still makes me question myself sometimes. Helping him changed things, but it also cost me. The emotional energy, the stress, the reopening of old wounds, it wasn't easy. There are days when I wonder if I should have protected myself more. If I should have said no and let him face the consequences alone. Maybe that would have forced change in a different way. Or maybe it would have broken something beyond repair. What I do know is this: choosing to help didn't mean I forgot how he treated me. It meant I chose to confront it instead of burying it. And that choice gave us a chance to rebuild something healthier, even if it's still imperfect. So, was I wrong for hesitating? Was I wrong for remembering that laugh on my birthday when he came asking for help? Or was that memory the reason I finally stood up for myself and demanded more than silence? I'm sharing this because I know a lot of people watching this have complicated relationships with their parents. Love and resentment can exist at the same time, and that doesn't make you a bad person. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't cutting someone off, it's staying and insisting on being treated better. If you were on my side in this story, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. Subscribe if you want to hear more real, messy stories like this one. And please, share your final thoughts in the comments. Would you have helped him? Or would you have walked away? I read every comment, and I'll see you all in the next story.